Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. News that Convent Bukit Nanas has not been granted its land lease extension by the Federal Territory's Land Office was met with public backlash in the past couple of days. Now, despite assurances by government that the 120-year-old school, girls' school I might add, that will not be demolished once the lease expires, the question remains, will Convent Bukit Nanas be preserved for posterity? Let's begin our conversation tonight with Tengku Nurul Azian Shariman. She's the past president of Convent Bukit Nanas alumni. Good evening, Tengku Azian. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, I want to begin with some news, perhaps addressing the news that has come out throughout the day. We've had, comments made by the Federal Territories Minister, Anwar Musa, saying that he's now weighing in. He wants to find out what he can do to help preserve the school. What do you understand to be the latest in this issue?
Good evening. Thank you, Melissa. Okay, I'd like to firstly say that the alumni is extremely alarmed and rather devastated by the news that the lease on the land where the school sits has not been extended, because the lease expires in September this year, and as you know, a number of children have just returned to school after a long period. They've been away from school because of COVID-19. And, they've just come back to school, they're just settling down, and now they find that, the situation has emerged, and it has worried a number of the students, the parents, the teachers, and the school community. Now, what we've heard from the minister is that the intention is to transfer the ownership of that land to the Federal Commissioners of Land, and the government is proposing to turn the school into a fully funded government school. I think the fear among the alumni is that it means that the mission authority will no longer be in charge of the school, but it would fall entirely under the purview of MOE. As you know, as a mission school, it's able to have a very unique governance structure, whereby it has a board of governors with representatives from the mission authority, the alumni, the PTA, and the senior school management. And the BOG, or Board of Governors, is the oversight body to oversee that the quality of education offering is excellent and is maintained at the highest level. And on the top of that, it also ensures that the value, tradition, the ethos, and character is imbued. They are imbued, these very qualities are imbued in the students in the classroom, outside the classroom, through co-curriculum activities. And one of the key roles of the BOG is to appoint the principal, if that's taken away, then perhaps there's a worry about the quality of the education offering will deteriorate. Now, we've had excellent principals like Mrs. Manuel, Mrs. Vimala Matthew, and now our current principal is Mrs. Rosman. And they are good, and they brought the school to a very high level. And that's because the BOG has selected them, have taken due care in the selection of the principal.
Tengku Azian, if I can just interrupt you at that point, do you think the concerns are premature? Because at this point in time, the Land and Mines Office says that essentially what they are going to do is to help maintain the building. And so this is something that they've clearly stated. There has been no statement to the effect that there will be any implications for this change in land ownership for the governance structure, the things that you have just mentioned. Is it premature?
I don't think it's premature, because currently as a mission school, it's known as a government-aided school. That means it doesn't get full funding from the government. Now, any shortage of funding to maintain the school has come from the PIBG, and that's the PTA, and the alumni. And the alumni is incredibly strong. We've done a number of fundraising exercises to sort of close the gap in terms of funding. Now, if you make it a fully funded government school, there's a huge risk that the mission school status will be eroded or gone. And I think that's the really big question that's at the top of our heads right now.
Right. Can I just...
And I just said...
Sure.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Tengku Azian, go ahead.
I think the odd thing as well is that, and this is a question of trust as well. I think there's an issue of trust here. Now, because the primary school is actually owned by the Mission Authority, parts of the secondary school is also owned by the Mission Authority. There's only one portion now that is under lease. So we are also not sure why, it was not approved, because it's very difficult to actually, take a portion out and say this is not part of the school, when you're already surrounded by various parts of the school, being the primary school and the other parts of the secondary school. So it's a very, very odd decision by the Departments of Land and Mines. Yeah. Okay.
How is this going to, I guess, impact the students in the school at the moment? You raised that as a concern. So there are future concerns of what could happen in the future. But right now, how is it impacting students at the moment?
Well, as I mentioned, right, our Malaysian students have gone through a really rough year. They've had to go on online learning, and quite a number of them from the B40 have not had any access to education because of lack of internet and tablets, etc., etc. So they've all shared, like, say, one phone in the family. Now they've returned to school, and they're looking for stability. They're looking to going back to normality, and then this issue drops in and it's gained a lot of traction on the media. It's been talked about, the alumni. There's a huge buzz about the alumni about this, and it's very disruptive to their learning. And it's not just the students, it's also the teachers. And I think this is not the right time to do this to our children, which should be the core part of the universe of a school, which is to protect their interests.
Tengku Azian, considering the luminous alumni that have, that in fact people our governance and political life, do you think an appeal at this point in time could work? And are you considering that?
I think what the government should do is actually talk to the Mission Authority and actually find a solution forward. And I actually love what Tan Sri Rafida Aziz said. She said, you know what, if a school is excellent, which indeed is Convent Bukit Nanas, why do you not fund it? Because Convent Bukit Nanas is one of the few schools that gives opportunity to the B40 students to have access to quality education. Now, the B40 students do not have access to private schools, to international schools that the top 20 have access to. So you should fund the school, whether it's under the Mission Authority or otherwise, because you want to benefit those that don't have access to quality education.
All right. Tengku Azian, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We appreciate you taking time to explain what's happening with the Convent Bukit Nanas situation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break here and consider this, but more on this issue in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada seperti orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita. Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada ke depan dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu.
Balik kepada seperti orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Kini berwajah baru.
Hi, thank you so much for staying with us on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation about the failure of Convent Bukit Nanas to have its lease extended for one of its 2 lots in its secondary school, on which its secondary school sits. So let's continue our conversation. Cultural Heritage Consultant Elizabeth Cardosa joins us on the line now. Elizabeth, good evening. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Can you help us understand, help us untangle this question of land ownership and building management and zoning and all of those issues, I understand, underscore the Convent Bukit Nanas story?
Well, okay, a couple of days ago, that a story broke, and there seemed to be this like major panic, concern, a lot of noise, lots of messages flying left and right. But really, if you're looking at it in terms of the school or the issue, the first thing is what the Minister of Land and Mines said very clearly was that the school will remain zoned. If you look at the City Hall local plan, the area is zoned education. And he's expressed clearly that it will remain zoned education. So there's going to be no change in the zoning status, which means it's not commercial. I think that there was a lot of concern that it was going to be commercial and it was going to be turned into a high-rise and, all that sort of thing, which given, I think, certain situations in KL and other parts of the country, maybe, it's not an unreasonable assumption, a presumption. So I think that that's one of the things. But really, if you look at it from a planning point of view, it has been zoned education and it remains zoned even in the current ongoing new local plan that is being prepared by DBKL. I believe that they have confirmed to the president of MIP that the Malaysian Institute of Planners that it remains zoned education. So I think the status of the place, of the school, of the property remaining a school, that particular piece of land is one thing. I think the point that was raised earlier about the fact, part of the school, the primary school, the older block, the one that's more iconic or more visible, I think, to the public, that is on freehold land. The other block is on leasehold land, and that's the block, or that is the ensemble of buildings. It's not even a block, it's a piece, it's a tapak, yeah? That lot will be, the lease won't be renewed to the HIJ, the Holy Infant Jesus Sisters, and it won't be used in that same. It isn't that the use will change, but they will no longer, I suppose, have control over what happens there in terms of it will remain education, but their input into the kind of education or how it's going to be used appears not to be able to be that. It's really quite unclear because, while the buildings on that lot were built by them, funded by the mission schools, and so presumably the structures are their physical property. The land on which it sits is not their property. The land on which it sits belongs to now, or in September, will revert back to the government of Malaysia.
Elizabeth, can I ask,
sure.
You can interject. Can I ask you if the fear that the land ownership dimension will actually impact governance? And that, I think, as we just heard from a former head of the alumni of the school, that is their chief concern. The issues of whether this is going to improve funding for the repair of the building is not a concern, because they said in the past they've managed to plug the gaps in funding. Their concern is the character of the school. Do you think that is at risk?
If you go by other examples, then possibly it's not an unreasonable fear. Where in other cases where mission schools or schools which were not under the national, were not set up by government, were set up by other bodies and then became nationalized in the process, so to speak, where they became fully government schools as opposed to government national type schools, then and the character changes, perhaps the curriculum changes, not so much the curriculum changes, but maybe the style of education changes. It has happened in the past. So I suppose it's not, you can't say it's an unreasonable fear in the sense of, but you don't know. I mean, at this point, because there doesn't appear to have been any discussion, I think that's what puzzles me really. Like, I'm like going, it's a bit bizarre, right? The Mother Superior, they applied for an extension of the lease 3 years ago, and pretty much on the cusp of the expiry of the lease, they're told that, or at least that's what appears to be have happened, that there was no discussion, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's good for you, we're going to take it back. And it'll be good for you because it'll be a fully government-aided school, as opposed to you have to apply to us for a grant,
right?
Or you have to find your own money, to fix the buildings while we take care of the teachers and you conduct the national curriculum,
right.
the teaching.
Can I come back
sure.
and ask something? Because you said that perhaps in previous cases that you could make the argument, or that there could be, it would be fair to make an assumption given the historical. The way we've seen, some schools, some mission schools become more national schools. But many people are making that comparison of the Convent Bukit Nanas story to St. Mary's, to Convent Bukit Bintang Girls' School. Is that a fair comparison?
It wasn't a convent, but Bukit Bintang Girls' School,
yes, that's right. So is that a fair comparison to make with these other schools?
Those schools have been demolished. The land was sold. The decision was taken, I think, in a different way by the Board of Governors or the school authorities, who, for whatever reason, sold the land on which it sat, and therefore gave up, I suppose, their right to retaining any direction as to what would happen to that piece of land, or whether the school, and move the school elsewhere. So I think that kind of comparison is not, it's not a direct comparison. No, okay. I would say.
Elizabeth, very quickly, the quality of that built heritage, is there something to be discussed about the nature of the school, the buildings?
Yes. Absolutely. I think that if you look at both the primary school and the secondary school and the ensemble of other sort of activities that go on there, the fact that there is an orphanage or the remnants of what would have been a very viable, very vibrant, this was in the days before the welfare department set up, orphanages, that kind of thing. This was a social support system that was established by the Catholic mission here, and the deaf, and there is a deaf school there. There are lots of different kinds of activities that go on there, beside the actual primary and secondary school in the national type as we know it.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's one in terms of its activity, because I think we really very often when we think about school, or we think about teaching, going standard 1 until Form 5, that kind of thing, or Form 6, but we don't actually think about the whole social network and everything else that goes on around it. And in this particular school, it has a very, very strong set of different traditions where it has supported very clear social agenda, I think, and perhaps even ahead of its time, if you think about it, because the majority of public schools, didn't have that kind of thinking or that kind of maybe drive, Right. So there was always that with Convent Bukit Nanas. Okay. And if you look at the buildings, and I think I'm talking about it from the heritage perspective, of course, you are looking at sort of buildings that first, the ensemble of buildings, it's an ensemble of buildings that demonstrates institutional use primarily as a school for education purposes,
right,
that were built from the early part of the 19th century through to current times, where there have been renovations and things like that. So you're talking about something like, 80 to 100 years of architectural history,
right? That's so
which you
much...
can see.
Yes.
And so there's a lot more, not just the numbers of people who went through the system, the kind of activities it ran,
Right.
but also physically the structures, are extremely important.
Elizabeth,
so
I really love that point.
Yeah.
The value we place on our built heritage is really important. Thank you for bringing that up. We're going to go take a quick break, but we'll come back and talk about that point that Elizabeth raised. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for speaking with us tonight. We will be back and talk more about how we value our built heritage. Stay tuned.
Data percuma bermula dan memastikan Malaysia ada kedepan dan maju. Induknya adalah Melayu Islam.
Orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Untuk memastikan Malaysia ada kedepan dan maju.
Induknya adalah Melayu Islam.
Orang yang membuat polisi.
Kalau itu yang dikehendaki, fine. Mungkin kita berbeza pandangan.
Tapi kita mempunyai kuasa yang boleh menentukan budaya di masa hadapan.
Polisi yang mesra wanita sudah tentu dia akan datang daripada pemimpin wanita.
Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. The controversy over the fate of Convent Bukit Nanas has opened again the conversation about how we value or the value we place on our built heritage. Now, this is a conversation that we return to every time a building or a place is threatened with destruction. But what can we learn from this history? Let's find out. Hamdan Majeed is the Managing Director of Think City, which has been doing a lot of work in the areas of resilience of cities and urban conservation. Hamdan, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, I want to ask you about the Convent Bukit Nanas story or the situation at the moment. Are the problems faced by CBN unique to schools of that era, built within that era, mission schools within that time period?
Thank you, Melissa and Sharaad, having us on the show. Now, on what you have raised, I don't think it's a typical issue in a sense that as what you call cities go through this process of evolution and transformation. There is great pressure on what do you do with the legacy built infrastructure that has been left behind, right? And great cities are able to harness them in terms of shaping the future of how their own cities take advantage of their
Malaysia in general. I think we are still at the space where we are not fully valuing our built heritage as much as it could be. In fact, I think there's greater amount of room for us to recognize how built heritage contributes in a positive way to create distinctiveness and also strengthens the identity of Kuala Lumpur.
Or in any other city in Malaysia for that matter.
Hamdan, I want to ask you though, specifically about schools, since, I think most recently in 2018, Maxwell School was designated National Heritage. We see this process happening, but could there be a decoupling between the built heritage and its use? So for instance, could it be that you keep those buildings, but you move the schools outside the city and turn those schools and those buildings into something else, as happens in countries like Singapore, where a particular precinct might be designated a civic area, museums and restaurants and performance spaces take the place of the school in the activities that happen within those buildings?
I think that's unfortunate consequence when city governments give up the opportunity to make their downtown areas more vibrant. And I think in that context, schools and this what you call civic infrastructure that exists in cities are important components of what makes a place more livable. And in fact, it's probably one of the basic foundations of why people want to live in the city. Schools, markets, and other civic amenities are important ingredients in building what you call a great place. And I think in this context, the reason why schools were originally built in these places was because population lived in these parts of the city and it served a particular purpose and use. While now populations have moved out over the last few decades, now the schools then becomes places that are probably does not have immediate population density around it. But then for these iconic schools in the city, like CBN and VI and St. John, they have got an important part of what I would call creating the spirit of place in the context, particularly in Kuala Lumpur, because they have been part and parcel of the history of the city, and they have been an important part of how they have generated hundreds and thousands of students over the years, in terms of shaping the landscape.
So Hamdan, does Think City believe that schools should remain in city centres? I mean, I'm just wondering, that there's been arguments made to remove schools out of city centres, and thinking about the trade-off. What does Think City have to say about that?
Our view is that while the past few decades has seen people fleeing the city centres to the suburbs, that trends are now reversing. In fact, in recent periods that we have seen, people are moving back into city. In fact, more buildings are being occupied by residents. And in one reason they move back is apart from the fact that they are closer to their workplaces and probably get access better quality of life with less commute and so on. The other reason why they also come to school, because there is access to good schools in the city, or there's still access to good schools in the city centre. So we believe that schools are an important part of attracting people to live in the city, and an important part of continuing the tradition of having schools in the city, so that people will want to use the city more and more, so that you do not only have office workers coming to the city and leave the city, rather we need diversified type of users of the city.
Right.
Hamdan, do you think, looking squarely at the Convent Bukit Nanas issue, is there a proper way, a better way of resolving this? Because there seems to be very little stakeholder involvement or engagement in this particular case.
I personally believe, because we are not privy to the conversations that have taken place behind the scenes, what we have seen is what has been discussed in the public domain. I personally believe that there could have been greater amount of discussions and deliberations, so that optimal outcome could have been achieved in terms of both for the school and for the landowners.
Definitely. Hamdan, coming back to the issue of built heritage, iconic schools like Convent Bukit Nanas, do schools like that or built in that era, do they have unique problems or opportunities when it comes to preserving their built heritage? Schools that are still in use, that students come in on a daily basis, do they face unique problems in that respect?
See, coming from Penang Preschool, which is an iconic school up in Penang,
all right,
I can personally say that being in a part of an old school with a very beautiful built heritage and so on, creates a different environment of going to school and learning and so on. Definitely, it's a big asset that is no longer. These days we do not build those kind of schools that has been there in our cities. So it's important that we preserve, we protect, in fact, and also unlock its full value by conserving it, and even finding ways to continue to retain and use them as schools.
Okay. Hamdan, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Sharaad. Thank you.
All right. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. We will be back with you same time tomorrow night. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Good night, folks.